Thank you so much, President Martin. As he mentioned, I am Bridget Hebbard. I'm your very raspy-voiced ASDC Operations Director. I do apologize. As you all know, I have significantly lost my voice during this meeting, which just goes to show that I will be speaking a little bit less on this panel, so yay. So this is a very important issue. As President Martin mentioned, ranked choice voting has more than completely reached the national stage. It is an electoral system of voting that allows voters to rank their candidates by preference, so that no matter who wins an election, every voter feels heard. I'd like at this time to reintroduce our panelists. I'd like to introduce New Mexico State Senator Daniel Ivey-Soto. The state senator is a lawyer and an overall champion, not just for ranked choice voting, but for accessible elections and accessible voting systems. He's quite the champion in the state legislature here in New Mexico, and I'm very excited that he was able to join our panel. Next, we have FairVote Minnesota Executive Director Jeanne Massey. She's an election reform powerhouse, not just in Minnesota, but she's an advocate for ranked choice voting at the local level, the state level, and the national level. And she's been a great partner with me on this panel and a great teacher as well. I want to thank her. And last but certainly not least, Will Robinson, who decided to sit over here. Will Robinson is a founding partner at the new media firm. He worked on the campaign to pass the Maine Ranked Choice Voting Initiative in 2016, and he was also campaign director at the Democratic National Committee under Ron Brown. He mentioned to me just a little while ago that he recognizes like over 50% of people in this audience, and he was both really excited by that and kind of shocked that everybody was still involved in state and national politics. So just another big round of applause to welcome my panelists, please. So as I mentioned, ranked choice voting is an electoral system in which voters rank their candidates by preference. If a candidate wins a majority of first preference votes, that candidate, he or she, is declared the winner. But if no candidate wins a majority, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and first preference votes cast for the failed candidate are eliminated, lifting up second preference choices indicated on those ballots. Then a new tally is taken, and if there's still no winner with an outright majority, we rinse and repeat. So at this time, I'd love to turn it over to FairVote's Minnesota Executive Director, Jeanne Massey, and then we'll kind of go down the line with our panelists, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Bridget. Good, everybody can hear me now. And thank you for inviting us here and having a conversation about ranked choice voting. It's a real honor to be in front of all of you representing Democrats across the country. I've been in front of my share of Democratic committees in Minnesota, and it's by far the funnest group of people that I get to be in front of. So it's really fun to be in front of a group now nationwide. And I want to speak to that for just a moment. I believe in Minnesota, this could be true in other states. Ranked choice voting wouldn't have made the progress it has made without the Democratic Party in Minnesota and the leadership of Ken Martin. Ken, thank you for inviting this conversation. Thank you for inviting me. And I just want to take a moment to actually honor Ken Martin and give him a round of applause for his forward thinking in having us here today. It truly is an important moment and an important conversation. The Democratic Party in Minnesota endorsed ranked choice voting, first of all, for the initiative in Minneapolis by the Minneapolis Democratic Party, the DFL party. In the big city, it has its own unit, and it endorsed the party, or endorsed ranked choice voting, and really helped launch the initiative in that city. And the same was true then in St. Paul. And in 2008, the party adopted ranked choice voting in the party platform, and it has been there ever since, and the party has been a strong advocate for it. So the Democratic Party has played a very key role in helping advance and educate people about this idea and supporting it as a way to provide more access to more candidates and more voters. And that's really at the heart of what ranked choice voting is about, is providing more access to more candidates and more voters, as Ken Martin said. It's much more inclusive. So I want to take a moment to just describe some of the success in Minnesota, because it's been a real leader in implementing ranked choice voting and in adopting ranked choice voting. And we're not alone. You may know that there are some 11 states that now use ranked choice voting, from the East Coast to the Bay Area, and many cities that are poised to implement it, and now, of course, Maine became the first state. But what happened in Minnesota was a real important focus on making sure that the elections went well when first using ranked choice voting. So it was first used in 2009. Minneapolis has had 3 elections using ranked choice voting. St. Paul has had 4 elections, and now St. Louis Park is the 3rd city using ranked choice voting, and it starts this year. What we've seen is really tremendous. In just a couple of election cycles, the power of ranked choice voting to do a few important things for our elections. One, increase the number of candidates that choose to run, and increase the diversity of candidates who choose to run. It changes how candidates are campaigning, making them much more civil and focused on substance and the issues that are before the voters. And at the end of the day, it can change who can win. So we have seen much higher turnout under ranked choice voting in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have seen Minneapolis City Council become the most diverse ethnically and gender-wise council in its history. And in St. Paul in 2017, St. Paul elected its first African-American mayor under ranked choice voting. And we see how easily voters understand the process and how much they prefer it over the old system. We hear a lot of questions about, isn't this going to be confusing for voters to switch the way they vote? It's actually so much simpler, because 1, they only have to come out once. 2, they get to rank their preferences and not be strategic, wondering whether or not they're going to waste their vote or vote for a candidate they don't like, because they really don't want to have to help elect the candidate they least like. And that whole strategic game is over. And more voters turn out because there are more candidates engaging them in the process. So we've seen big benefits at the local level, and we see that promise also extending to state level politics as well. So I'm hoping that all of you take away today the learnings from Minnesota and elsewhere and apply that back in your home states. I want to recognize 2 other people in the room today. Rob Ritchie was given a shout out at the National, if you've not yet had a chance to meet him. We have Kyle Bailey here from Maine, and he's a resource. He helped win the campaign in Maine. And we have Maria Perez here from New Mexico. And we have elections happening at the local level here in New Mexico as well. So it's happening across the country. Hopefully it can happen in all of your states here soon as well. So I want to just make one more point before I hand over the mic. Because of the extensive use now across different cities in the United States and now in Maine, ranked choice voting has moved out of the incubator state. We no longer have to prove that it works. The infrastructure is there. The blueprints for how to do this, both in nonpartisan local elections and in state partisan races and primaries and general elections, that's all there. The infrastructure is ready to go. So when U.S. states are ready to go, we can do it. And now we see the opportunity to expand ranked choice voting really pretty quickly moving forward, because the past decade has been spent getting the infrastructure in place, and we're ready. So I'll pass the mic on from there, and hope to answer lots of questions that you have.
Thanks so much, Jeanne. I'd like to pass it on over to Will Robinson from the new media firm. Will was instrumental in working in Maine in 2016 to pass their ballot initiative. That ballot initiative was passed to make ranked choice voting the voting method for every election at the state and at the federal level in Maine. And in 2018, they were able to implement state elections using ranked choice voting. Will?
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It really is. I'm seeing a lot of old friends. Morris Marine, I know, so I was the campaign director under Ron Brown, and I know the senator had mentioned coordinated campaigns. Well, Paul Tully was one of the people that led us on that, and I'm very proud of that time we spent in the party. I'm from Maine, and I am a reformer, but I also worked hard for ranked choice voting because I'm a Democrat. And I knew that this would benefit Democrats. In Maine, we have a rich history of third-party candidates running, or fourth-party candidates, or fifth-party candidates. Since 1974, 9 out of 11 of our governors were elected with less than 50%. And you all may remember Paul LePage, who was elected with less than 40%. And many people running in a first-past-the-post system was responsible for Paul LePage's reign of terror. So many of us joined with reformers to help pass this. City of Portland had ranked choice voting since 2011, but Maine being an initiative and referendum state, Kyle Bailey, who you just introduced, and a massive grassroots operation put it on the ballot for the first time in 2016, and it passed. Now, some people in the entrenched political system don't exactly favor that. It was a series of legal challenges, and the legislature voted to postpone ranked choice voting. And in Maine, we have a thing called a citizen veto, and we vetoed the legislation actually by a larger vote than we passed it. And we had both a gubernatorial primary in 18 and then federal elections in 18. And in the 2nd Congressional District of Maine, we defeated Poliquin using ranked choice voting. And this was the first time an incumbent had been defeated in that district since 1912. He had won the first round by 2,000 votes, and then was defeated by 3,500 votes when those third-party candidates won. I have a few final points to make. First, and we'll talk about this, ranked choice voting is easy. We do ranked choice voting all the time in our lives. I would like a Heineken. We don't have a Heineken. What's my second choice? I would like a Clark bar. We don't have a Clark bar. I'll take a Hershey's bar. Our lives are full of these decisions, and one of the things that Kyle did was beer elections, where people would do ranked choice voting on beer. Second thing, you may have felt that voters are a little bit pissed off, angry, disenchanted right now, and this is very empowering. And I'll show you a little video in a second where it wasn't just the technical aspects of ranked choice voting, it was the idea that it gave people more choice and more voice. And the spot I'll show you is like, you don't have to vote for the lesser of two evils. You can actually vote for the person that you want. But finally, I think it's an important tool for us. A lot of it discontent, especially on the left, means we're going to have people running against us from the left. And we saw in presidential races and Senate races, when you have a Green Party or an independent running against us, they siphon off those votes and we lose. And that this gives us the opportunity to bring those votes along. The second thing, though, is that those candidacies are not always genuine. They're being amplified by the Russians and the right wing. And Felicia will tell you what we just saw in Wisconsin was immense right-wing bot activity going on in a Supreme Court race. And that ranked choice voting is a way to counter that. And I've done a lot of work on this, and I'd love, as the meeting wraps up, to talk about that. But finally, I think that where people are looking at it for the presidential, it's going to help us build consensus around the nominee, where we're not going to have someone getting 14% of the vote and winning a primary, but help accumulate that. So I wore blue today. I'm a reformer, but I just wanted to put down that many of us who are active Democrats really support this, and that Maine has led the way once again, and hopefully in 2020 we will use this to defeat Susan Collins. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Will. At this time, I'd love to turn it over to New Mexico State Senator Daniel Ivey-Soto. Senator?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Bridget, and thank you all for coming to New Mexico. Appreciate you all coming to our beautiful capital city, and I hope that you all enjoy yourself quite a bit while you're here. Let me just a couple things real quick. First of all, by way of some additional background, in my case, I used to be the Associate Deputy Secretary of State for Elections, Ethics, and Legal. I was the State Election Director in the Secretary of State's office. I also have done 2 terms as the Chair of the Elections Redistricting Policy Committee for the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I currently serve as the Vice Chair of the Federal Board of Advisors to the United States Election Assistance Commission. In addition to my day job, because in New Mexico being a state senator is volunteer work. We're the only state where we don't get paid. So my day job is actually as executive director to the county clerks around the state. So elections really is my jam. And so in that regard, I was very pleased when Joe Kuborik, who's just done an outstanding job. Really, and it really is that teamwork that you guys were talking about before between the officers of the party, the work that Marga's been doing here in New Mexico, as well as the executive staff of the party in terms of what Joe has been doing, that really can help to transform an entire state and give a lot of confidence, and Joe really has done that. And so he called me up and he said, Senator, we've got this panel coming up, and I know your schedule is busy, so I just need to find out from you, are you really sure you can make it, kind of sure you can make it, you might be able to make it, or you don't think you'll be there? If you could just rank how you're going to be able to show up, I'd appreciate it. So let me tell you all just a couple quick stories. We had a few years back, one of my colleagues in the state Senate made a transition out of his seat in the state Senate, eventually into prison. And the governor, it was a conservative Democratic seat, and the governor at the time, we had a Tea Party governor, and more on that in a moment. And so she appointed a cowboy to that seat, a Republican. And when it came time for the next election, we had a former state senator who was the first openly lesbian senator in the state of New Mexico who ran for that seat. She won the primary. She did a fantastic job. She worked really hard. But a lot of people were concerned about how is she going to do in the rural areas. And about that same time, as we were going towards the general election, there was a Green Party candidate who decided to run for that seat and filed papers to run. So, of course, we all know where we're at right now, right? Is that the Democrat and the Green agree on 95% of everything. And from our perspective, the Green Party candidate is the sworn enemy of the Democrat. We have to kill her. We're not, are we videotaping this? I'm sorry, we have to find a way to disempower that candidacy. And so I get into the same trouble in the legislature. So so ultimately, with some people's work, that person did not qualify as a candidate. Why? Because she would have brought an extra 10% of people into the race, but she would have taken 10% of the votes from the Democratic candidate. And it was a close race. And in the end, the Democrat won in a 1-to-1. Under ranked choice voting, we welcome the Green Party candidate. We embrace the Green Party candidate because she's going to bring 10% more people in. And even though she'll take 10% of the first round votes away from the Democrat, those 10%, most of those votes will go to the Democrat in the second round, and the additional 10% of people who come in to vote will also, the majority of them, go to the Democrat in the second round. And so, in fact, that additional candidate helps to assure a Democratic victory. It's a very different way of looking at how elections run. That Tea Party governor that we had, she served from 2010 until 2018. In 2014, we had, she ran for re-election. And in the Democratic primary, we had a 5-way primary. One of the candidates was the son of a very popular, the only 3-term governor we've ever had in the state of New Mexico. And his son was running. And he started with 35% of the vote. On election day, he got 35% of the vote. He didn't expand at all. But the other 4 candidates pretty well equally divided. So when we talk about, a lot of times when I talk to people about ranked choice voting, they say to me, well, I believe in a majority. Well, I do too. And by my math, 65% of people who voted not to have this person as the candidate of the party is the majority over the 35% who voted for that one person. That's my math, that I'm pretty sure 65% is greater than 35%. And so it all depends how you rack up that majority. Because in the end, what we had was a standard bearer for the party that was not supported by the rank and file of the party. And so the Tea Party governor got reelected. It was disastrous. So this is where, and I will tell you, actually, Deb Haaland, who you all heard from earlier, she was our lieutenant gubernatorial candidate in that election. And it was one of these races where towards the end, everybody was saying, yeah, never mind the gubernatorial candidate. Deb is awesome. You know? And when people start doing that, you know you got problems. And in fact, by the way, Deb is awesome, and she's doing an amazing job, as you all saw. So in the end, ranked choice voting is about no longer, as that video showed, no longer having to vote your fears, but being able to vote your aspirations. There are a lot of different electoral reforms that people have implemented, such as California's jungle primary, other kinds of things, in order to do constrained choice. What ranked choice voting allows is real choice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody, and thank you to our wonderful panelists today. We do have a couple of microphones in the aisles if anybody has any questions. And while people are potentially thinking of their questions and walking up to the microphones, I would just like to follow up with a real quick question here. Through my massive learning process about ranked choice voting, one of the things I noticed was that the majority of places where in the United States where ranked choice voting has been adopted and implemented is in our cities and in our municipalities. Can one of our panelists please explain why ranked choice voting has been implemented first on the city level as opposed to the state level?
I can start that conversation out. It's a great question because in terms of organizing and expanding this at the state level, it's important to understand how it's taken root at a local level. It began at the municipal level, really in the Bay Area. San Francisco, back in 2004, began this new wave of ranked choice voting, which, by the way, is not a brand new idea in the United States. It was used in the early part of the century, but kind of had a resurgence in the early 2000s following the Gore-Nader-Bush election in 2000. And subsequent elections, and a string of plurality elections in gubernatorial and legislative races that you had referenced, really causing a lot of harm in our states and in our cities. So cities took it upon themselves to say, well, we can do better in our elections. And cities have the power, many, by their own law called a charter. Many cities are charter cities, and those charters can be changed or amended to adopt a different voting method from what state statute provides for them. So almost all cities that have done this, but there are some that have been done legislatively. Most cities have done it by citizen initiative. Most of the time, and this was true in Minneapolis and St. Paul, questions have been put forward to the voters on a ballot, and the voters say yes or no. And in 9.9 out of 10 cases, voters say, yes, this is more democratic. This will give us more choice and more power. We want ranked choice voting. So it's really happened by that ballot process. But now that it's been in more use over time and more proven, some cities are saying, well, we don't want to go through the complication of a lengthy and costly ballot measure. We just think this is a good idea. So last year, St. Louis Park in Minnesota, their council voted unanimously to adopt this. Cities, I think, have started this not only because they have the mechanism to do it, but because our states and Congress have become so gridlocked. Cities are the innovative places where new ideas and good ideas are emerging and showing us the way. And if it weren't for all that great state use, or city use, I doubt Maine would have been able to pull off what it did historically in 2018. It built on those city examples, and we're not done. This is catching on like wildfire. Cities across the country are now saying, sign me up. It's cheaper, better, more efficient, more inclusive, more empowering. And it won't be long, I believe, that states are going to say, we're going the Maine way, and we're going to do ranked choice voting as well. It just needed to bubble up and prove itself, and I think we're at that point.
And by the way, one of the things we've been able to do in the state legislature in New Mexico is actually we passed a state law that says any municipality that has in its charter a top two runoff may, by ordinance, adopt ranked choice voting because it's between different runoff forms without having to go through the formal process of changing their own charter. They can switch between the two. So.
Excellent, thank you. I see we have a question from the brand new elected this year Oregon Chair, Casey Hansen. Hi.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. So I'll be really brief in my questions, but I do have two, and the second question has two parts. Number one, Oregon has a number of cities that actually do block plurality voting. In other words, mosh pit of people, like 8 candidates run for 3 positions, and the top 3 get elected. Some of them, you know, the range between 20 and 24% most recently in one of our local counties in the metro area. Number one, would a ranked choice voting apply to that type of current voting system when you have multiple candidates in a block? Number two, I want to ask specifically about the delegate selection process. I want to understand if there are any other states that actually use ranked choice voting, and what are the complications in terms of technology and cost? Thank you.
I'll start with the multi-seat ranked choice voting because it's an important question. At the municipal level, or at a school board level, or at a county level, many cities have vote for up to 2, vote for up to 3, and you elect 2 or 3 at a time. That's very common. We use ranked choice voting in that constellation of multi-seat for an independent body called the Park Board in Minneapolis and a taxation board. So we do it. It works really well when there are more candidates to elect. It accommodates a proportional outcome, so you actually represent more voters. So the more candidates or more seats you have to fill, the better ranked choice voting actually works. So we've got the tools to do that. That works perfectly well, and we can share that model too. And the equipment that's available can now tabulate races that whether or not they're single seat or multi-seat. A big problem with those multi-seat races now under the current system is the practice of bullet voting. There's really no election worse than a multi-seat plurality election. They're very disproportionate in their outcome. Bullet voting is a common practice, and in fact, it has been the lead motivating reason why we have a representative who's the chief author of our local options bill in Minnesota, because he's so tired of seeing candidates doing the bullet voting practice to get on the school board, and they create havoc. And they really only get there with their base. So it's a good solution for that outcome. And then I'll let others answer some of the other questions.
Yeah, let me just do the delegates part real quick, and then I'll pitch it over to Will for the tech. So so on the delegates aspect of it, really ranked choice voting is very nicely designed for this, right? Because it actually gets to a better representation of where the Democratic Party is, as opposed to who a single block of voters is, notwithstanding where other voices may be. And so it actually gets you to a better consensus place in terms of who's representing the party. And you know, right now, I know that, for example, in New Mexico, a lot of our elections where we do multiple voting, we do a proportional voting system where we do a divisor so that somebody can get elected out of a 400-member body. They can get elected with 12 votes, right, depending upon how many people you're electing if you divide it out. Well, that person might get elected, but do they really represent the body? And with ranked choice voting, you're actually able to get there. And how you get there is the technology part, so let me pitch it over.
Yeah, the technology actually has been an easy transition. And in Maine, they designed software to do the calculation for each round. And it was really kind of interesting was when they got all the data loaded up, they literally had a computer and they ran the calculation. If it didn't have a choice, they would give the ranking and then run it again and run it again. And the campaigns, the public, the press were able to watch it. I think the other thing is there's a great deal of concern about integrity. and that we were able to, in Maine, keep it a completely closed system where there was absolute data integrity the entire way, so there was no chance of interference in that. So we have the technology, and I think in some ways the fact that we had transparency, even though some people were, wait a minute, he got more votes in round one and now he lost, they still saw how that worked.
Excellent. So we've got, where's my timekeeper? About 5 minutes left. Terry Anderson, the chair from the great state of Vermont, if you've got a quick question.
I do.
Yeah.
As some of you may know, our largest city in Vermont experimented with ranked choice voting for 2 elections. It was brought in by referendum, and it was ended by referendum. And I guess the question I have, and we discussed it last night, is how do you avoid those situations? It was some very particular politics around it, where it resulted in the election of a mayor who became unpopular and got tied up with him. But I think it's really important to understand that once you bring it in, you still have to make sure you've got a grassroots movement around it that understands it, that's committed to it, because that experience has been a real barrier now to us seeking to bring it back at any other level in Vermont. People are gun shy about it. So it's not just that you enact it, it's done, and everything's solved. You gotta build the support for it and keep it.
So I think you said the most important thing, which is the O word, organizing, that we need to build communities around this and support. And in Maine, there was a huge grassroots operation. It sustained the campaign through lawsuits, it sustained the campaign through legislative attempts to stall. And I think it's really important. And that also there was a great effort for education. And the education was helpful, but the education also created people who were evangelical when it came to the issue. And any electoral system, we need to keep our eye on it. Elections are fragile. The most perfect system won't stand by itself, but I think in some ways we sometimes move technology before we move organizing. And I think that Maine has an excellent organizing tradition, and I think that's why we're able to, and we will able to sustain it. There's a sheet going around somewhere. The popularity on ranked choice voting among Ds is in the high 80s, and I think statewide it's in the high 70s. So still incredibly popular.
That was a great question. I believe this is our last one. Maya Rockymore Cummings, the chairwoman from Maine.
Maryland.
Oh, Maryland. Sorry. And I've been hearing Maine so much this morning.
Although I was
apologize,
conceived in Maine, according to my parents. Lake Winnipesaukee, to be specific.
Well, hey now.
But anyway,
It's going to be
that's
five
another story entirely.
5-1 crabs for lobsters, though. Okay.
So I'm in Maryland. This is bubbling up in Maryland. But qualitatively, the feedback I'm getting is that that many people of color view this as a white liberal scheme to undermine minority voting power. And they view it through the lens of racism within the Democratic Party. And so there are several parts to this. I don't know if you know, but in Maryland, we just actually had a speaker's race where the Black caucus, who are all Democrats, were attempting to caucus with Republicans in an effort to get a first ever African American Speaker of the House. It was more important for them to actually have an African American than it was important to have a Democratic consensus. And so I guess there are several questions here. One is, have you thought through the politics of race? I'm curious in your race, the African American that won the mayorship, if he was actually the top ranked choice from the very beginning. And then the second part is, are you appropriately thinking through the whole notion of party ID and how this actually will play out over time? I actually anticipate, like for example, in the state of Maryland with our dynamics, African Americans running under other parties, not necessarily the Democratic Party, and actually winning because of something like this. So I just like to hear your thoughts and what analysis you've done to think this through appropriately.
So let me just start off real briefly on this, and one of the things that may not be evident to everybody who doesn't know me, my last name being Ivey-Soto, my family's Cuban. and I'm currently the Western Chair of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators. And so this is something that we've actually taken a look at within NHCSL through our national staff. And what we found is that in fact it actually creates a better system of empowerment in many situations. In fact, what we find happens in a lot of situations is that you end up with, particularly if you have a majority-minority district, you end up with 3 or 4 candidates of that majority-minority within that district, and then 1 Anglo candidate, and that person seeks to kind of go up the middle in order to get elected. And what this does is actually, it actually is a protection against that, so that you still have that voice of the entire community getting to that final round of where the vote is. So we, within NHCSL, I'll tell you our analysis of it, we support it, and we believe that it actually helps our community.
The use at a municipal level is really important to have a good understanding about how ranked choice voting actually empowers and diversifies local leadership. And we think that could happen at a state level too. So here's how this dynamic plays out. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, ranked choice voting replaced what used to be a 2-round system, a primary and a general election. The problem is, who came out to the primary? No one. And the primary voter was always not just small, but typically whiter, older, more affluent than the general voter in the general election. So without that primary filter, all kinds of candidates now have chosen to run, and they win, and especially people of color. So when I said Minneapolis now has the most diverse city council ever, it's because of ranked choice voting. There are a couple of cases, and I'll tell the story of one. This is a story in Ward 4 in Minneapolis. The council member is Philippe Cunningham, an African-American transgender candidate. Won his election. He did not win the most number of first choice votes, but he built the coalition so that when those candidates were eliminated in the process and the votes were reallocated, he was the candidate with the most support and the majority of support from the community. And he built that by building a coalition of people of color and candidates of color in that race. In the case of the mayor in St. Paul, he did win the greatest number of first choice votes in his race, and in fact he won with a popular vote of 51% in the first round. And a big reason for that was because there was an outside expenditure piece that was extremely awful against him. And that propelled him into a first place victory, because ranked choice voting really punishes strongly that kind of behavior. People have other places to park their votes, and it works against candidates who do negative campaigning and outside groups who do negative campaigning on behalf of candidates. So we have seen ranked choice voting from San Francisco to Minneapolis to places with large, diverse communities of color being hugely advantaged because of ranked choice voting.
And let me just say that on the campaigning and the negative campaigning aspect very quickly, there's because a lot of the campaign consultants are frustrated because they're like, oh, but we have to be nice. Right, but the thing is, that doesn't mean you cannot differentiate. And really the strongest example of that is London Breed in San Francisco, where at the very end, it was a 3-way race, and at the very end, the question from the newspaper was, who should be the second choice? And there were these other 2 candidates who had formed a coalition, and they each said, oh yeah, the other person. And London Breed said, nobody else should be your second choice. I should be your choice. She differentiated herself, and she won the race.
Bridget, if I can, for just one more point I wanted to make on this particular issue, and it also highlights the opportunity we have to use ranked choice voting in the presidential election. Rob Ritchie and others in the room are working on making sure that goes well in the states that have chosen to use ranked choice voting in the presidential primary. The worry without it is that the votes will be split many ways amongst people of color, amongst women, et cetera, because we don't have that opportunity to pool those votes and build the coalitions that we can when we use ranked choice voting.
Well, I hope that all of you found this insightful. I know I did. Please thank our fantastic panelists. Senator Daniel Ivey-Soto, Jeanne Massey from FairVote, Minnesota, and Will Robinson from the new media firm, and a special thanks to Bridget for moderating. Thank you all so much. They'll be around if you have additional questions. So